Welcome to our podcast, which is brought to you by the consortium of the ECOLitAct project. ECOLitAct is co-funded by the Erasmus Plus of the European Union. Our aim is to tackle climate change by enhancing media literacy and promoting sustainable practices. This podcast is dedicated to you with the knowledge needed to navigate the complex landscape of environmental challenges and misinformation. In this podcast, we will explore the urgent issues of climate change and media literacy by bringing expert insights, practical advice, and inspiring stories to empower you to make educated decisions and take impactful action in the fight against climate change.
First, we have Dr. Alexandra Panos, an assistant professor of literacy studies at the University of South Florida, who focuses on community-engaged education to enhance climate literacy and justice. Joining us is Angelos Patras, an energy storage project manager and consultant, driving innovative solutions for sustainable energy practices and empowering youth leadership in the energy transition. Our final guest is Professor Kimberly, a renowned sustainability scientist and author, who provides actionable insights on climate change through her best-selling book, Under the Sky We Make. Stay tuned as we dive into a conversation that promises to inspire and inform on the power of education, energy, and sustainability. Climate change and sustainability are daunting challenges. What specific problems or issues motivated you to dedicate your career to these areas?
I started working on climate education and how it intersects with my specific area of the field, literacy studies, about 10 years ago. And when the opportunity came up to work on a project with my then advisor for my PhD program, it was about, how do we address reading online about this complex topic because it's so politicized, in particular in the United States. We have to deal with that. And in general, I was interested in the politicization of complex topics online and how people can critically read about them. And so I came at it initially from, my substantive area rather than a focus on climate change. The more that I did the work, though, I realized that environmental issues of sustainability, and doing good work to create conditions where a habitable planet for all beings is actually part of just who I am. I was raised in Missouri in the United States, which is in the central part of the United States, in the woods, and spent a lot of time outside and caring for the land that I grew up on. Both of my sisters are environmentalists. One works for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service on endangered species, and the other works on animal conservation and care. And so we all ended up there, and I got there sort of circuitously. But the more I spent time, the more I realized that that was actually the central part of what I cared about. And while I'm in the field of literacy, I'm going to do everything I can to center the earth and how to keep us all caring for it and it working well for as long as I can.
So I first became aware of climate change back in 8 or 9, something like that, because of Al Gore's book, An Inconvenient Truth, and was essentially saying that, climate change is an issue, we need to deal with it, or it's gonna come back and bite if we remain inactive, which I found very shocking that nobody, was talking about it as much, because at the time there was a discussion around the ozone layer, which was a thing back in early 2000s, but, it wasn't well understood in terms of its scale and severity. So that's how I got into thinking about it. I then became the president of the UNESCO club of my school, which also dealt with climate change among other things. And then after I graduated school and uni, I became more involved through volunteering groups that I work with. One is with an engineering federation. The other one is with the Commonwealth. We try to recommend policies to governments with regards to climate action. So that's kind of where I obviously worked in the space of civil engineering, which by extension has a big impact and is very correlated to the environment, because you're building stuff.
So I grew up on what was a dirt road. It's now paved, but out in the countryside, about an hour north of San Francisco, in a town called Sonoma. So it's a really beautiful spot in the hills with oak trees and creeks full of tadpoles and frogs to catch. And I spent a lot of time in nature as I was growing up. So I think that was a big influence for me. When I started university, I had the chance to work on research projects that were about climate impacts on ecosystems in California. So in the White Inyo Mountains on the border with Nevada, some of the oldest creatures in the world, the bristlecone pines, live there. And we were tracking how vegetation was changing with climate change in those mountains. And I worked on some projects looking at the effect of elevated CO2 on grasslands. So basically, from these early experiences, I really enjoyed research. I enjoyed the creativity research. And over my career, I've pivoted from focusing on the impacts of climate change, because we now know quite definitively that they're numerous and bad. And there is interesting science to be done there. But for me, the most important science where I want to contribute is on how do we stop climate change? How do we actually halt further warming and protect the people and places that we love?
Were there any pivotal moments or challenges you faced early in your career that significantly shaped your approach to addressing climate change and sustainability?
So my advisor, James D'Amico, was who introduced me to this topic. We kind of started doing the work together a little bit. He began in, 2011, beginning to think about this. And so his work was, and just talking with him a lot, was really influential, because he brought those two ideas together and made it clear to me that I could care about this topic within in the work that I was doing in literacy, which is still not super explored. Another person that was very influential for me was my father. He was the one that would take us walking in the woods and talk to us about, what was in the landscape and what was going on there. But ultimately, it's been books for me. So like the time spent in the environment, just like in nature, but then reading about the human complexities, like the part of the socio-ecological, has always been where I sort of make connections. Unlike my sisters who are like, we're going to care for the animals and land. And so reading folks like Naomi Klein and witnessing the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, when she wrote about disaster capitalism and the closing of the schools in New Orleans following the disaster and horror that was the human side, really also pushed me to think about the world as not just beautiful nature that we should protect in its perfection, but what do we have to be doing, and how do we do it better, and how do we make the world a just and safe place for people and for animals and plants and our more than human companions on this earth. So the more I thought about that and the more I began reading about the ways that we sacrifice people, I got more and more passionate about doing the work. So that's been the biggest things, I think.
When I left uni, I joined a company that was a groundworks company, which means they would do everything, a building or a house, everything from the ground floor down. So the work that we did, you couldn't really see. However, this company was looking for young engineers to run construction sites, which means practically they had to be legally liable for whatever happened on these construction sites. They pushed me, and I managed to get all of my my licenses to run construction sites on my own. And that's when I realized that I have a good level of agency, of authority over what happens on site, which oftentimes is, a part of the construction industry that's not so well monitored sometimes, in the sense that, you have your designers that adhere to standards and they do their work according to, certain scientific rules and so on and so forth, that go on to customer who pays for that to be built and then on to the contractor to actually build it. But when you go to construction sites, there's a lot of discounts with regards to quality and environmental protection. And that's when I realized that, you know what, I can actually make a difference in the real world here.
I think the first thing that came to mind was actually when I started my PhD, I had the idea I would be working in a tropical rainforest. And I had this kind of brainwave sleeping on my friend's floor that I really wanted to focus instead on something closer to home that I had a personal connection to. And I think that's actually shaped a lot of my research and career choices since then, that for me, it's quite important to study things that I really care about and know well. And of course, I love going to new places, meeting new people and learning new things. But I think that emotional connection with the things that are at stake from climate change has been important for me to maintain.
Reducing our carbon footprint is crucial, but it can be challenging. What barriers do individuals face in adopting effective actions to reduce their emissions, and how can these be overcome?
This question is so hard because we get these lists, right? Like if you go on The Guardian or on New York Times or whatever, but I think that people have a tendency to oversimplify. And instead of doing the introspection to kinship with the world around us and our relationship to the systems that keep it in place, sort of take our metal straws with us instead. And so I think that from a literacy standpoint, one of the things that I value about literacy is education, and the way that I conceive of it is that we have to be reflexive and action oriented in our reflexivity, not just in, the simple things, but okay, so who am I in relationship to the world around me, to the systems that I'm part of, to the communities that I'm responsible to? And then what does that mean for how I then act in relationship to it? For me, literacy means understanding and then action. And so it's not just I understand that eating less meat is good for the environment and then I don't eat less meat. It's I understand that the systems of animal industrial harvesting creates this sort of environment and does these things to animals. But then perhaps the most important thing is that action also includes communication and care for your communities. And so Katharine Hayhoe talks a lot about just talk about it and communicate with clarity and curiosity, and being in conversation with people at different scales is really important. I can talk to my uncle who maybe has a different perspective than I do on why we need to care for the earth and what that looks like. And so I don't shy away from that. I do it, and I do it with care and curiosity because I think that's important. And so I guess I use my literacies as an individual to join different communities that I'm a part of to make the case for these sort of simple things that you can do, because I've sort of taken time to introspect and do that. And I think that that is a better way to think about how we can be as individuals, that we're thinking about those individual actions, but as part of what groups we are in and which communities we're a part of. I tell a lot of teachers that I work with, talking to your colleagues about, do you talk about climate change with your colleagues? Is this something that comes up? And, and these are people that, are using their metal straws and getting rid of their lawns. Here in the US, we are big on lawns and, getting rid of their lawns and planting native flowers and, doing all of these things that are synonymous with environmentalists or someone that cares about the climate. But if we're not talking about it within our communities, then I think that individual action falls short.
Carbon emissions are generally only one metric that we can use to measure climate change and our impact in this world. The reason why it's so widespread is because it's the best one that we have. For various reasons, maybe we don't go through this now, but ultimately carbon emissions are one that's hard to track, but there's also our waste, whether we recycle. There's a lot simpler things that an individual that's not particularly educated in the climate space can do. The barriers are many, unfortunately. The first one is what I said, complexity. It's hard to understand how you emit carbon as an individual. Obviously you drive a car or you might get on a plane, and these are easy ones to quantify in a sense. But it's also your day-to-day, how much food you consume. That has, a supply chain behind it. When you buy a steak at the supermarket, there's the plastic packaging on that piece of meat or food, whatever it is that you purchase. And these, add complexity in this whole conversation. So that's number one, complexity. I think number two is also there's no enabling infrastructure, as we call it. So for instance, even if I didn't want to take my car, if there's no public means of transportation to get me where I'm trying to go, I'm kind of stranded in my options. If we were to look at the southern hemisphere of the world, for instance, if there is no public transport or no infrastructure for electric cars, then using old-fashioned combustion engines, very bad emitters, very low-efficient engines, is the family to make its living, So it's also a survival. If you were to take it down the line, it's also a survival issue for some, the lack of enabling infrastructure. Policy is an important one. That say we want to do things, but then big business also comes into play and they need to step up their game. Investment decisions are also made depending on policy positions and directions, and these are not something that can be defined by individuals. However, an individual's activity within a company is defined by policy as well. So that could be something to work on as we progress.
Well, I think it's important to start by acknowledging that about 90% of the world does not need to reduce their carbon footprints. So actually, people on Earth already have a sustainable carbon footprint. The poorest billion certainly have room to increase their consumption to meet their needs. And a large group of what's considered the global middle class has consumption that is pretty much in line with carbon budgets once we get our acts together and have emissions-free energy and services. So when we talk about carbon footprints, it's really only the wealthiest 10% who need to think about our carbon footprints. So essentially, if you earn over about 27,000 US dollars, that's in Swedish units. I think it's 35,000 US dollars per year. You are in the global elite because you're in the top 10 wealthiest people, 10% on Earth. And of course, the higher your income, it's very, very strongly correlated with emissions. So the highest emissions come from the wealthiest people. So the more money and options you have, the more important it is to look at your own carbon footprint. So we often hear these kind of discussions about the constraints to individuals reducing their footprint. And that's absolutely true and important to make it the default, the norm, the easiest and cheapest option to the one that's the most sustainable and the lowest emitting. So that takes policy and infrastructure changes. But when we talk about carbon footprints, a lot of carbon footprints come from luxury overconsumption. It's from a lot of flying and driving is the biggest piece of carbon footprints. And those are done by the people who have the most power and choice and agency, and therefore actually the lowest barriers to making those changes. So there's, of course, still a lot of work to be done, but the good news is that the people who are most able to do the work are the ones who need to do it.
You've studied various climate policies. What common problems have you observed in the implementation of these policies, and what can be done to enhance their effectiveness?
So I'm going to stay in my lane here and not pretend like I am a climate scientist or a government official who studies climate policies, and I'll think about education. I think that we do not think enough about how far-reaching education policies are and will be. When I talk to people, I say, okay, so have you heard about some of the legislative policies that are being put in place in Florida that have to do with banning books and banning curricular content, including banning language on climate change in textbooks? Like, have you heard of this? And, my colleagues across the country and around the world sometimes are less familiar with our experiences here. But what I can see shape out or play out, and what I have learned from how those policies are being implemented in schools is that even if there isn't an explicit policy that says you cannot teach climate change, it is political and it is bad, teachers, because of the politicization of education content policy, get afraid and back off. There's a lot of policy in place right now, in particular where I live, that stokes fear about what we can and can't talk about. And that terrifies me. And the way that policy plays out is that people don't talk, and young people who have a right, I believe, like a right to education for their future on a changing planet, to that kind of education aren't getting it. Teachers aren't being trained. Curriculum isn't being developed that will support folks. And that's the kind of like softer climate policy, or anti-climate policy that I think we don't talk about. And as social scientists, it's one of the reasons that like it's so important we have a voice and are present in conversations about climate issues, because this isn't like the long-term education of our youth around the world is an issue of justice, and it will affect all of us if our world isn't educated.
There's a term that's called MRV, which is monitoring, reporting, and verification. Essentially, the enforcement of policies is what is lacking. Even if a government or an international organization recommends a policy and this is implemented, it's hard to make sure that is actually adhered to by big business, by individuals, So MRV is an important way to look at it. Now, we need to be clear that climate change is the result of an industrialization of the Northern Hemisphere. And therefore, we are trying to now transition away from that fossil fuel into sustainable energy, if you like, based economy, with all the, side problems that it might cause, like in the production of plastic and so on. The transition away from such a well-established industry to something new is inevitably painful and has a lot of friction. So what we could do, there's plenty of recommendations. An interest came about again recently from Antonio Guterres in general would be to ban advertisements from fossil fuel companies. If you listen to podcasts on Spotify, you will hear ads from British Petroleum, BP, and many, many other fossil fuel companies that are trying to greenwash their business. But we all know it is their business that is causing these problems.
Well, climate policy is absolutely essential. We won't stabilize the climate without bold, robust, ambitious climate policies and actually putting those goals of those policies into practice, so achieving those policies. So we're kind of in the phase right now of global climate action where on paper there actually are many reasonably good goals, and what we need to do is hold governments and businesses accountable to meeting the goals that they have stated. There's definitely room to improve those goals, and if you look at a really good resource is the Climate Action Tracker, which assesses the policies and pledges of countries, for example, against what's needed to meet the Paris Agreement targets of limiting warming. And many countries are not ambitious enough, but we're starting to get in line with the goals, and then we need the policies to deliver them. So that's absolutely essential. If we're talking about the individual level, we identified 5 roles that individuals can play for high impact climate action. And I would say the most important of those is as a citizen. That's a really critical role where we can make a huge difference for the climate. We also have roles as professionals, investors, consumers, and role models. So I would put the carbon footprint idea under the consumer role of our personal household consumption. And that is really important to lead by example, and it's part of creating cultural shifts as well as reducing emissions. We also have these other roles where it's super important. And, we've developed a new tool, this kind of choose your own adventure guide to climate action. And there we identify the citizen role as the most important, and within that, the most important role being to vote. How do we get good climate policies? We need to elect and hold accountable politicians who care about climate, who know their constituents care about climate, and who are ready and willing to implement bold climate policies.
Misinformation about climate change is widespread. What are the most significant challenges in promoting media literacy to help the public discern credible climate information?
First of all, I think it's really important that we recognize that when people read something, they're attaching a lot to that reading. If you think about older people, they're attaching all of their identities to something that they've read really quickly. It happens so fast. All of our values immediately flood into that reading and how we're making sense of it and what we do with it. So the confrontational nature of social media in particular just reinforces how people see themselves, and it just creates, I don't know, like I think about it like a scar, like a cut that then like the blood clotting is like plaquing, right? So it gets thicker and thicker and thicker. So it's just like deep. And like if you try to rip that off, like it's just going to gush everywhere. Like there's all sorts of stuff you could go with that. Very gross metaphor. But if we know that, we can respond with curiosity. Asking questions is a really good way to have more open conversations about information that is not accurate and intentional disinformation as well. But the challenge too is that when younger people and cultural relationships among older and younger people are different around the world, but at least in my experience, as a younger person, sort of pushing back and being angry about an older person not understanding something, that also creates these value differences and identity differences that can become entrenched in place. And experiences of folks that are older than me, when they're talking about why they think something versus just shutting them down and being like, you are wrong because you don't understand the internet. And I think that that's really important to teach young people to, I don't know, like humility. Like we need to have some humility when we're interacting with people, even if we know they're wrong. Like even if we're like, you are wrong. Because we are probably wrong about things too. You know, I'm wrong about stuff all the time. So that's one part. But the other thing, I guess, is that I feel hopeful about the fact that young people are resisting some parts of online information, online spaces. And I hear this from my students, and I hear this from kids that I interact with, that they recognize that it's a soup of disinformation, and it doesn't mean that they engage with it perfectly, but that they have resistances to the ways that online spaces have been built for them, and they've been inserted into those online spaces without their say-so. So I guess I just think, like, if we consider the assets of the people we're talking to when we're talking to them about disinformation, we have a better way forward than some of the practices that I have engaged in and seen become really normalized, which is very sort of aggressive, almost violent, like reactions that just make people double down and build that clot bigger and deeper. I don't have perfect answers. The disinformation campaigns are so well funded. They come from people with vested interests in perpetuating the status quo and deepening, extraction and wealth building for few at the expense of many. So the one benefit to acceleration of climate change is that more and more people are experiencing its impacts firsthand. And that's the other thing we know about how people tend to change their minds on most things. And unfortunately, the more that severe weather, wildfires, heat, like the extreme heat that so many of us have been experiencing this year, impact folks, the more I think that they will recognize that things need to happen and things need to change. And so those are softer ways too to go about things, like, well, that tornado hit right next to you, uncle, you're so lucky, that it was a category 6 that didn't exist, an F6 that didn't exist 10 years ago. What do you think about that? And speaking from our own experience with climate impacts here in Florida, I talk a lot about hurricanes and our aquifer depleting and phosphate mining and the things that are happening to us here to help as well. So those are ways that I tackle disinformation, knowing that I am not as well funded or effective in countering.
There's one thing that's important to establish, right? There's no doubt by anyone in the world that climate change issue. That's the foundation of any conversation around this topic, because we are now, as a whole, as a species, transitioning away from that narrative of, hey, it's a man-made myth or it's a conspiracy or whatever. That's, objectively speaking, at this point, agreed to not be the case. We know that global warming is because of greenhouse gases and emissions, things, and it is something that's caused by human activity. It's not a natural cycle of the earth. It's purely, due to us, to society's activities, generally. So that's the baseline. Now, how do we deal with misinformation is a very interesting question. I don't have a silver bullet for it, because we are now in an era where there is a lot of information about everything. So I think it lies somewhere, whether that's the education space or on how social media, but also the education of younger people as to how they can verify a piece of information, whether it is fact or not. Two different problems there, because ultimately the way that you train your young and how they evolve and how they transition as well, when they turn 18, 20, 25, but how you train your already grown-ups for their use of new technologies can also severely impact the way society runs, because these people also vote. So we have to be clear that, misinformation is tackled as a whole and not just with regards to climate change. I mean, there was a big, I don't know if you followed the last US elections, but there was a big concern around, Russia meddling with social media in the US to sway the results one way or another. The EU had similar concerns. There's a lot to be said around, what social media can do to public opinion on any matter. So, yeah, I don't know. Education is where my hopes lie. But yeah, well, there's no easy way out. Maybe, we could increase taxation of this big social media a little bit more so that they can filter out what's put on there, a bit better. And another solution I've heard, which I don't know, I haven't thought of, and I don't know personally how I feel about it, is mandatory identification of users online. So actually having to show your passport or your ID in order to use a platform. That has many, implications with regards to what happens to this data, who has this data, etc., etc. But it is a way to make sure that nobody hides behind this anonymous mask, if you like. That's so easy to get. So, yeah.
Well, you're absolutely right. There's been a very well orchestrated and unfortunately very successful climate disinformation campaign. So deliberate misleading and misconstruing of the facts and questioning settled facts and those who share them in an effort to try to delay climate action. So we have very good evidence of that, both from academics like Naomi Oreskes at Harvard. Her research has been really essential here in uncovering climate delay and misinformation, and many of her colleagues, and also from investigative journalism has played a really important role. So we know that there's been and continues to be climate disinformation from a small group of actors trying to delay climate action. To inoculate ourselves against misinformation. John Cook studies misinformation explicitly. He has some great resources, including online courses you can take, tool detecting and debugging disinformation. But one really powerful tool is called the truth sandwich. So a common mistake is to restate and kind of re-emphasize something that's false. So if a climate dismissive person makes a false claim, it is better to actually start with the truth. So to say, for example, if someone were to say the climate isn't warming, that used to be a common line of argument, 20 years ago. I think now people are not making that argument because it's very obvious, not just to scientists looking at, ice bubbles and temperature records, but to anyone alive on planet Earth. We're seeing unprecedented climate events, including extreme heat. So people are experiencing the warming, and the records also very much back that up. So it's no longer credible to say that. But let's say, for the sake of example, someone said it's not warming. Rather than diving into that claim and trying to unpack it, it's better to start with a truth sandwich of, what the evidence shows is that warming has occurred, and the recent warming of the last few hundred years is in fact caused by human activities, mostly burning fossil fuels. And that's been agreed to by all of the world scientific councils and actually all of the world's governments through the UN climate panel. So despite this claim that some think it's not warming, there isn't evidence to support that. And the truth is, it is warming. Something like that, maybe not the most elegant example, but something that sort of, emphasizes the truth, acknowledges the misinformation in the middle of the truth, and then ends with the truth. So you're sort of centering the truth rather than centering the misinformation.
In the context of climate change, what are the key obstacles to integrating media literacy into education systems? And how can these be addressed to improve overall climate literacy?
Yeah, so a lot of what I just said, but when it comes more specifically to like media literacies and paying attention to how information circulates and what information is available, it's so complicated now. With AI, I think it's just got thrown into a blender and whirred up, which it was already sort of a challenging landscape. But like, we know about how to teach people how to be critically media literate. It's just not happening in schools in the US, at least, consistently across the country. And I'm less familiar with other places around the world, but I have a guess that it's probably not perfect anywhere. We're still really new to media literacy. I know that like people think it should all be figured out, but if you take a longer scope of history, it's been 25 years that we really are trying to deal with this. 25 years is not that long. But it needs to be solved. We need to be doing things. So there's a lot that's out there about critical media literacy. So like the basics of it are out there. Like, how do you evaluate sources? What do you use to do so? The content is changing rapidly. Like, how do we look at deepfakes? What does AI mean for critical media literacy? But when it comes to climate change, the challenge with it, again, where I live, and I try to stay very much in my lanes here, knowing that there are resonances around the world, but with my experience, the differences too, is that it's been so politicized in the US, horrifyingly politicized, which means that instead of starting from, which I believe we need to do, starting from climate change is real, we know that this is true, it has human and social impacts that are uneven and unjust. Now let's look at media. Teachers here have this binary framing. We need to look at both sides of an issue, and it's really ingrained into our education culture. So they'll have debates about climate change, and instead of it being a debate about a policy, it will be a debate about the reality of climate change, even though, here in Florida, 93% of people believe that climate change is happening. It's still stuck in that mentality. And, that is something that I work really hard to break down when I teach literacy to folks. Is like, no. You start with the science, you start with the reality. And then there's lots to debate. There's so much to debate. We could have so many debates about like the complexity and nuance of things. Like there are so many good debates in the climate, like policy field right now. Like, are we hopeful or are we not hopeful? Like, are you a Hannah Ritchie person or are you, like less, are you real freaked out and, like apocalyptic about it? Like that's a legitimate debate to be having. And there's so much good content. Like there's so much good information in there that could be explored, but instead you fall back on the politicized debate. And with good reason, teachers are attacked by communities, for doing things that are politicized here in Florida and across the United States. But that to me is the biggest challenge, and the way to overcome it is just to say, this is the reality. Let's go to something more nuanced and complex, and then deal with all of the soup of media literacy related to AI and deepfakes and all of that stuff is, the next step. But I'm going to focus on the content and try to get people past that binary debate.
Education, similar to policy, often lags behind society. For a government to introduce policy changes that then impact education to turn into changes in reality, that whole chain takes time. It seems like we'll always be lagging behind these big businesses who operate at much faster paces. So I don't think there's anything other than proactive legislation that we can do with regards to education. So we know an easy example that's very hot at the moment is artificial intelligence. We know large language models, what we call as AI at the moment, will play a big role in the next decade. So we should therefore legislate to include that in our education systems. We know machine learning is going to play a big role on the way that information is processed. So we should also make sure that, this is tackled accordingly, appropriately in our legislation, firstly, and on our education systems, secondly. How do we do this? Well, I don't know, but we certainly need legislators to talk with the specialists in those fields to come up with what is the safest way. It's not a simple exercise to try and bridge that gap between science and legislatory bodies and government bodies also. So yeah, I think proactive legislation and policy making is the only way forward.
Well, there's lots of great resources out there. So the Climate Solutions Journalism Network, for one, comes to mind. Oxford has a great climate journalism program. There are media literacy courses and resources for teachers. I think obstacles are teachers are overworked and underpaid. That's a very big obstacle. But for the climate issue in particular, I think climate has become politicized and polarized, and it is common for humans and teachers among them to avoid issues like that, to not want to stir controversy, for example, or to worry about being perceived as biased, for example. There used to be this idea of two-sidesism, that the idea that you should sort of discuss and debate settled scientific facts. And we now know that that is not a productive use of time. And it's very interesting and important to have, and in classrooms, to have debates and to be able to make arguments supported by evidence and reason. But the kinds of debates we really need regarding the climate crisis are, what are the solutions? How do we prioritize them? Who should pay for them? What is fair in terms of who does what and who bears what costs or burdens? And those are not scientific questions. Those are really ethical and moral questions. So I think there are a lot of ways to incorporate accurate, nuanced climate information in the classroom. And there are resources out there for teachers, but it's not entirely easy.
Given the challenges we've discussed, what is your key message to our audience on tackling the problems of climate action and sustainability effectively?
All of us have a stake in a world that supports all life. And all of us have a relationship or a connective tissue to something on this planet, unless you're very unwell, that wants you to do something to contribute. I really love the All We Can Save project. They do this beautiful job of asking people to think about who they are in the world and what their strengths are and what they contribute. And it's such a way to think about okay, I have ways of contributing to a habitable planet in the future, and I'm unique in that, and I am connected, and what does that look like? And for me, when I think about that, like, I go to like what my strengths are. I'm a researcher. I'm an educator. I have networks of teachers. I get to talk to students all the time. And so that's where I do my work. I also do things outside of work, but, I'm connected to local environmental groups, and I show up at the cleanups, and I talk to people constantly about climate change because people underestimate other people's perspectives on climate change. We think that we're much more isolated and don't care, more than we do. And so if we think about our connectivities, our relationships, all that has taught us how to be in the world, the good parts, we can keep on keeping on, even in the face of really scary times and the overwhelmingness of it. There's this wonderful environmental justice news organization here in Florida called the Marjorie, which is named after 3 of our environmental mothers, all named Marjorie here in Florida. They have this amazing series called Dispatches from a Sinking State. And it's all normal, everyday folks who are invited to contribute to this series. And they talk about what it feels like to sink and to feel overwhelmed by environmental degradation and climate impacts. But each of them is so tied to like where they are, like you're sinking into your state, not just because you're overwhelmed, but because you know that like when you dig your toes into the earth and the sand and the water, you learn and can grow and can connect and do something about whatever specific thing it is that needs done. So I think that that's the other message is, when you think about the global impacts of climate change, for me, that is like debilitating. But when I think about like, what do I need to do where I am on this living earth, that feels better. It also resonates. There's just a lot of people thinking that right now. This is, there's a recent edited volume by our National Poet Laureate, Ada Limon, called You Are Here. And that concept of like, where are you? What can you do there? What do you know? Who do you know? What can you contribute is just much better than looking around and thinking the earth is on fire. So, I encourage people to think, where are you? What do you know? Who do you know? How can you contribute? And
I mean, I wish I had a nice one-liner, punchline to share, but I really don't. And I've had this conversation asked, a lot more frequently recently than I did in the past. I think my main message is that everybody has agency, like everybody can and should, I think there's an ethical obligation there as well. Everybody can and should make a change in their small habits in their day-to-day life so that they can, create a better world in the future. Every little thing that we do comes together and builds up into what we call society. So if we as individuals make the decision to change this little habit, recycle, it's an easy one, or use less plastic. When you buy fruit, maybe don't put it in a plastic bag, use a paper bag if both are available in the supermarket. It's a very easy change, that most people don't think about. Or similarly, take your own reusable bag to the supermarket rather than paying 10, 20, to get more plastic bags that you end up using for rubbish in the end. At least that's my experience in Greece, with my family. So, agency, it's important to understand. And once you're finding small improvements in your day-to-day life, maybe you'll approach more important problems differently too, as in who you vote. What's the priority? What's the main criteria for who you vote might shift a little bit. The way that you engage with people that are might also change. So a gradual cascade that small changes can create that matter, but all of that depends on every individual, every person understanding they have agency, firstly over themselves and secondly over what society does.
I would say no one can do it all, but everyone can do something. And what really matters is to figure out what your contribution can be the work that you can do and to make that contribution. So it's easy to get overwhelmed by the enormity of the problem. It is a really big problem, but it's not going away until humans fix it. So we really need more people on Team Climate. And by kind of broadening the scope of what climate action looks like, and in particular by focusing on just sort of a handful, for citizen, investor, professional, consumer, and role model, I hope that people can find a way of contributing that is sustainable, they can keep up over the long haul, that hopefully is fun, that actually doesn't take that much time. 20 minutes a day or a couple hours a week can be really transformative if you're focused on the right things. So I would really encourage folks to check out the tool if they're interested that we've built. It's at We Can Fix It on the Substack platform, and it's free. And I'd love your feedback. Or to keep doing what you're already doing. Many people already are working really hard on climate action, but I think, focusing our limited time and energy where it really matters is really, really important.
Are there any pressing issues or upcoming initiatives related to climate change and sustainability that you believe our audience should be aware of?
Yeah, so education policy and its imperative in a future habitable planet, and not underestimating that, especially now that we know what's happening, like we know things. So now we need to look at the social intersections with that more fully, and social scientists need to step up to do that. For me, I think what's most pressing is the injustice inherent in climate impacts. Or it's not inherent. It's inherent right now with our current systems. We take for granted and assume as naturalized the ways that injustice works in extractive and economically driven ways of responding to the climate crisis, instead of saying, why? Why is this the way we're going to proceed? Why are we normalizing these impacts having most effect on the more than human communities that we should be responsible to and working with, and low income communities, women, people of color, the global south. Like, we know these things and we need to stop pretending like those are normal, acceptable ways to respond. So, the most recent example, although I think Hurricane Katrina for us in the US is the most horrific example that I can conceive of. But here in Florida, just a couple years ago, Hurricane Ian slammed into the Gulf Coast town of Fort Myers Beach. It was a little beach community, not lots of high rises. Most of the people there couldn't afford to lift houses or make them hurricane ready. And they all got flat. They were all gone. And so now what's being built is a Margaritaville, the Jimmy Buffett Margaritaville restaurant. Everything is being raised. These houses cost millions and millions of dollars. And where are those people? They are gone. They do not live there anymore. They physically can't afford to live there. And so where did they go? You look, there's no one that knows where they went. It was too small of an event to be tracked the way that Hurricane Katrina migration was across the country. And those people, it's just like dust in the wind. Like, what happened to them? They are somewhere. They didn't die. They just are no longer home. We no longer have people there who understand the community, that care for the community. We have big giant houses of rich folks who are going to come in for a couple months in the winter each year. And it's just so clear. And it doesn't have to be that way. So I just feel like the more we can sort of say why, why is really important in any disaster, whatever is happening across the country or the world, is where we need to be. So yeah, those are the big ones. I could list off all the things that I'm worried about right now, but that's not worth anyone's time. You list off yours, wherever you are listening, you list off yours and then ask why.
The Summit of the Future that's taking place in New York later this year, that is essentially a summit at a UN level to discuss what our future looks things considered. That's a very interesting space to look for, because I'm sure there's going to be a bunch of interesting things coming out of that. The European Union space is a very interesting one. I don't know if you followed the European Union elections, but I expect there's going to be quite a few changes coming in the political landscape of Europe, and that, together with the US elections later this year, can significantly shift the way the role the West has to play in, the global status quo, the zeitgeist, as we say. So that's a more political thing. Now, if we were to talk about climate more specifically, there's COP29 in Azerbaijan taking place later this year. I think it's mid-November. And there's also the nationally determined contributions that are due out to the UNFCCC. The nationally determined contributions are essentially a country's own targets and goals with respect to 2015. So that's where our government, the Greek of each government, will say what the country can do with regards to the climate space. So it's important for us to understand what the government is putting forward and try to push that ambition up as much as possible.
Maybe that comes to mind is thinking about carbon removal. So that's gotten a lot more attention in the last few years. And I think it's really important that we explore and develop options to remove carbon that's already in the atmosphere. But it will not make a big difference for climate unless and until we actually stop burning fossil fuels. So the main cause of climate change is burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas, and that's mostly to heat and cool our homes and move stuff around. And until we switch to clean energy to do those things and get rid of fossil fuels, we're going to still have a worsening climate problem. So it's critical that we stop using fossil fuels as fast as possible. And carbon play an important role, but ultimately a pretty small role for the sort of remaining maybe 5% or so of emissions that are technically impossible or extremely difficult to eliminate, or that are judged to be so essential and important that we don't want to eliminate them in certain applications. But basically, we need to defossilize as fast as possible, count on carbon removal to real reductions.
This podcast is offered to you alongside the development by the consortium of a handbook with 6 lessons that focus on identifying effective strategies to reduce emissions, combat overconsumption, and implement sustainable practices while improving our ability to critically evaluate information, identify misinformation, and engage constructively with climate-related content. To know more about these, follow our partners on our website and on social media. Join us as we delve into the critical issues at the intersection of climate action and media literacy and discover how we can all contribute to building a sustainable future together.